The world often feels like a place of ordinary rhythms. Families rise, work, and rest in a peaceful routine, with nothing extraordinary to interrupt the flow of life. In the small village of Kaijiang District, tucked away in the rolling hills of Sichuan Province, everything appeared as it always had. Fields of green stretched to the horizon, children's laughter echoed from the streets, and the elderly sat together, reminiscing about times long past. Here life moved slowly, as if untouched by the chaos of the outside world. The air carried the fragrance of nature, a mix of wildflowers, fresh earth, and the sweet breath of summer. But what the villagers could never have imagined was that behind the closed door of a humble home, in the quiet shadows of this peaceful community, a crime was taking shape. A crime so horrific, so incomprehensible, that it would defy everything they thought they knew about the world around them. It started as any other evening would. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the landscape. But inside the home of Mouliang, a simple farmer, things were unraveling in a way no one could have predicted. The relationship between Mouliang and his daughter-in-law, the woman who had married his son, had long been strained. What had begun as small, unspoken frustrations grew into something darker, an undercurrent of resentment that festered, fed by long-held grudges and a deeply rooted, twisted perception of his daughter-in-law. In the depths of his mind, Mouliang's delusions took hold, convincing him that she was a threat, an obstacle to his family's honor, a disturbance in the order of things. But how does a man who once watched his son marry a woman who became a part of his household, transform into someone capable of such unspeakable violence? The police were called to the scene on a routine matter, expecting a typical domestic dispute. What they found when they entered that house would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The scene was one no officer, no human being, should ever have to witness. The room was heavy with the acrid scent of blood and something else, something that clung to the air, something so wrong that the seasoned investigators instinctively recoiled as they stepped into the room. The body of the woman, Mouliang's daughter-in-law, was found in a state that defied all logic. Her face was unrecognizable, her features so disfigured, so mutilated, that even those trained in handling the aftermath of violent crimes couldn't reconcile the image before them. Her eyes, gone, her limbs severed and discarded. Her body was a grotesque canvas of jagged wounds, each one deeper than the last, each one a mark of pain that could never be erased. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that left the officers stunned. It was the sheer lack of humanity in the way it had been carried out. An act so cold, so calculated, that it felt like something from the pages of a nightmare. There was no rush, no sense of panic in the way it had been done. No, this was a carefully orchestrated act of violence. Every wound, every severed limb, deliberate and precise. The question that echoed in the minds of everyone who encountered this scene was, why? Why would anyone do something like this? When Mouliang was arrested and brought in for questioning, the horror didn't end. Inside the sterile, white-walled interrogation room, under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, he sat there, calm, almost unnervingly so. There was no guilt in his eyes, no sign of regret. He wasn't trembling in fear. Instead, he stared at the officers with an unsettling indifference. And when the question came, "Why did you do it?" his response was chilling, devoid of emotion, and disturbingly simple. She deserved to die. There was no explanation, no justification, only a statement. In his mind, it was clear. She had wronged him. She had become a problem that needed to be dealt with. His delusions had convinced him that this violence was not only necessary, but inevitable. But was this really just a case of one man's disturbed thoughts gone awry? Or was there something much deeper at play? As investigators began to dig into the case, they uncovered layers of a twisted family dynamic, one that had been hidden in plain sight. What they would discover was a tangled web of emotional manipulation, unspoken threats, and the silent complicity of those around him. His community, his family. Had they known what was happening? Had they seen the signs? Or had they simply turned a blind eye, content to let the violence build until it exploded in this unimaginable way? In the days that followed, the case became more than just a local crime. It became a national scandal, one that shook the very foundations of how we view family, honor, and responsibility. The brutality of the crime was a stark reminder of the dangerous power of unchecked rage and the devastating consequences of silence. What happened in Kaijiang District was not just an act of murder. It was the collapse of something that had once been whole, a family, a community, a sense of security. It was a violent reminder of the things that we fail to see, the things we fail to acknowledge, and the things we allow to fester in the darkness. This is the story of Mouliang, a man who chose to act on his delusions in the most horrifying way imaginable. It is the story of a daughter-in-law whose life was brutally taken from her, but it is also the story of a system of family, community, and silence that allowed this tragedy to unfold. And it forces us to ask a question. When does silence become complicity? When does turning away become a decision that costs someone their life? The question remains, if someone had spoken up sooner, would things have turned out differently? Could the tragedy that unfolded inside that house have been avoided? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if we don't pay attention to the warning signs around us, whose voice will be silenced next? Before tragedy struck, the lives of the victim and her family appeared unremarkable, even routine. But as we've seen time and time again, appearances can be deceiving. The victim, a young woman in her mid-20s, had recently married into Mouliang's family. By all accounts, she was kind-hearted, cheerful, and eager to build a life with her husband. Friends and neighbors described her as a devoted wife, always respectful toward her in-laws, and willing to shoulder the burdens that came with living in rural Kaijiang District. Her husband, a factory worker, often spent long hours away, leaving her to navigate life within the household on her own. But beneath this idyllic exterior lay a brewing tension. Mouliang, her father-in-law, was a man with deeply rooted beliefs in family hierarchy and tradition. To him, a daughter-in-law was not an equal member of the household, but rather a subordinate, bound to obey without question. Any perceived slight or challenge to his authority, no matter how small, became a source of festering resentment. Neighbors later revealed whispers of odd behavior from Long. He was described as a man who demanded control over every aspect of his family's lives. Some even spoke of his unspoken hostility toward his daughter-in-law, though none thought it would escalate beyond verbal disagreements. Hindsight, as always, casts these observations in a chilling new light. Despite the growing tension, no one in the household or the community intervened. Family matters were considered private, off-limits for outside interference. In the silence of that rural home, resentment grew into rage, and rage transformed into something far more dangerous. The events of June 2021 unfolded over the course of a single harrowing afternoon. What began as an ordinary day quickly descended into a nightmare. Mouliang had reportedly been stewing over a perceived insult from his daughter-in-law, a minor disagreement over household responsibilities that most would have dismissed without a second thought. But for Long, it was the final straw. At approximately 3 p.m., he lured his daughter-in-law into the storage shed under the pretense of needing her help. What happened next can only be described as an act of calculated cruelty. Long, armed with a variety of sharp tools, attacked her with a ferocity that defies comprehension. Her screams, though loud, went unanswered. The rural isolation of the home, coupled with the cultural norm of not intervening in family disputes, meant that no one came to her aid. The brutal assault lasted for hours. By the time Long was finished, the woman's body was barely recognizable. Her face had been disfigured beyond recognition, her limbs severed, and her eyes cruelly removed. The wounds, more than 24 in total, painted a horrifying picture of her final moments. When questioned later, Long claimed he had no intention of killing her. His goal, he insisted, was merely to disable her, a claim that only deepened the horror of the crime. To him, his daughter-in-law had become an object, a symbol of defiance that needed to be punished. When the police arrived, the scene that greeted them was nothing short of horrifying. Seasoned officers, many of whom had dealt with violent crimes before, were visibly shaken. The meticulous brutality of the crime suggested not a momentary lapse of judgment, but a premeditated act of violence. Investigators immediately took Mouliang into custody. In the interrogation room, his demeanor was chilling. He was calm, unapologetic, and even defiant. When asked why he had committed such a heinous act, his response was devoid of any emotion. She deserved to die. The investigation uncovered troubling details about Long's mental state. For years, he had harbored delusions about his daughter-in-law. He believed she was disrespectful, insubordinate, and a threat to the family's honor. These thoughts, left unchecked, had warped his perception of reality. Forensic teams meticulously combed through the crime scene, piecing together the sequence of events. The tools used in the attack were recovered, each one bearing traces of the victim's blood. Witness statements from neighbors painted a picture of a man increasingly consumed by paranoia and resentment, but none had thought to report his behavior. As the case gained national attention, psychologists and criminologists weighed in. They noted the alarming intersection of cultural expectations, untreated mental illness, and unchecked rage that had led to this tragedy. This wasn't just a crime, it was a failure of the systems meant to protect vulnerable individuals from harm. Mouliang was eventually charged with the brutal murder of his daughter-in-law. His trial was swift but contentious, as his defense attempted to argue diminished capacity due to mental illness. The court, however, found him fully responsible for his actions and sentenced him to life in prison. But for the victim's family and the community of Kaijiang District, the scars left by this crime will never fully heal. The case sparked nationwide debate about the cultural norms that discourage speaking out against abuse and the urgent need for mental health resources in rural areas. In the end, this tragedy serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of silence. It forces us to ask difficult questions. How do we recognize the signs of danger before it's too late? And what can we do to ensure that no one else suffers a similar fate? June 21, 2021, began like any other day in Kaijiang District. The sun had barely risen when the village stirred to life. Farmers set out to tend their fields, the rhythmic sound of hoes striking the earth echoing through the quiet air. In the Long family home, the day appeared routine, ordinary even. But behind closed doors, tensions simmered. Mouliang, the family patriarch, was seething over a trivial disagreement with his daughter-in-law. The previous evening, she had refused to comply with one of his demands, a small act of defiance that ignited a storm in his mind. Around noon, Long was seen pacing the yard, muttering under his breath. Neighbors later reported hearing loud voices coming from the house, but no one intervened. Family disputes, especially those involving in-laws, were considered private matters in the tightly knit community. By mid-afternoon, Long's simmering anger had reached its boiling point. At approximately 3:01 p.m., he called his daughter-in-law to the storage shed under the pretext of needing assistance. She followed, unaware of the horrors that awaited her. Inside the dimly lit shed, surrounded by rusted tools and farming equipment, Long snapped. Armed with a machete and other sharp implements, he launched a savage attack. The first blow was directed at her face, a calculated strike meant to disfigure. The brutality escalated with each passing second. Her screams echoed through the walls of the shed, growing more desperate with each cut. Neighbors later admitted to hearing the commotion but dismissed it as a family argument. In this isolated community, intervention was rare, even in the face of obvious distress. For hours, Long subjected his daughter-in-law to unspeakable violence. He severed her limbs with chilling precision, removed her eyes, and inflicted dozens of wounds across her body. Blood soaked the dirt floor of the shed, pooling around her lifeless form. When the attack ended, Long stood over his victim's mutilated body, his breathing steady, his face devoid of emotion. He made no attempt to hide his crime. Instead, he calmly walked back to the house, leaving the shed door slightly ajar. It was Long's son who discovered the gruesome scene hours later. Returning home from work, he followed a trail of blood leading to the shed. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. His wife's dismembered body lay on the dirt floor, surrounded by the tools of her destruction. Her lifeless eyes stared back at him, or rather where her eyes should have been. In a state of shock, he called the police. When officers arrived, they were greeted by a scene so horrific that many struggled to maintain their composure. Even seasoned detectives described the crime as one of the most brutal they had ever encountered. The meticulous cruelty of the act left investigators stunned. The injuries suggested a level of premeditation that was both calculated and personal. Each wound told a story of rage, control, and a complete disregard for human life. But what was perhaps most chilling was Long's demeanor after the crime. When questioned by police, he showed no remorse. Instead, he justified his actions, claiming that his daughter-in-law's defiance had left him with no other choice. His lack of empathy was as shocking as the crime itself. The call to the Kaijiang District police station came just after dusk. Mouliang's son, his voice trembling with shock, described the scene at their family shed. When officers arrived, they weren't prepared for the horror awaiting them. The small shed stood in eerie silence, the faint sound of rain tapping against its corrugated roof. Flashlights illuminated the blood-soaked floor. Officers stepped inside, their boots sinking into the mud mingled with human remains. Forensic specialists carefully documented the scene, their faces pale, their hands shaking. The victim's body lay in disarray, a harrowing testament to the brutality she endured. Her eyes were missing, her limbs detached, and dozens of wounds marked her torso, each one meticulously documented as evidence. One officer later admitted in an interview, "I've seen my share of crime scenes, but this will haunt me for the rest of my life." Key evidence was quickly identified: the bloodied machete, a collection of rusted tools, and a torn piece of fabric clinging to the edge of a workbench. Yet what struck investigators most was the eerie calm surrounding the scene. Nothing was hidden. The brutality was left on full display. From the very beginning, the investigation was fraught with challenges. Mouliang was taken into custody almost immediately. Sitting in the dimly lit interrogation room, he displayed a level of defiance that unsettled even the most experienced officers. He refused to answer direct questions, instead repeating one chilling statement: "She deserved it." Neighbors and family members were initially uncooperative. When questioned, many shrugged off the crime as a family matter. They admitted to hearing the commotion that day, but claimed they never imagined it would escalate to such violence. Some even defended Long, portraying him as a strict but fair patriarch. This apathy frustrated investigators, who were racing against time to piece together the events leading up to the murder. Forensic experts faced their own set of challenges. The crime scene, though rich in evidence, was contaminated by rain and the initial chaos of the discovery. The victim's body, ravaged by the attack, required extensive examination to determine the exact sequence of events. Despite these obstacles, the team pressed on, driven by the need for justice. The case began to shift with the emergence of crucial witnesses. A neighbor, speaking under the condition of anonymity, recounted an incident months earlier when Long had been overheard threatening his daughter-in-law. Another family member admitted that Long often harbored delusions, believing that his daughter-in-law was trying to undermine his authority in the household. Forensic analysis provided another breakthrough. Microscopic traces of the victim's blood were found on a machete in Long's possession, and detailed wound analysis confirmed that the attack was premeditated. Experts noted the calculated nature of the injuries, suggesting not a spontaneous act of rage, but a deliberate attempt to dehumanize the victim. Psychological evaluations of Long painted a complex picture. He exhibited signs of deep-seated paranoia and delusional thinking. A forensic psychologist involved in the case described him as a man consumed by control and fear, unable to separate reality from his distorted perceptions. These insights added depth to the investigation, revealing a history of tension that had escalated. As the investigation deepened, a troubling pattern emerged. Long's behavior had been a source of concern for years. Relatives described him as controlling and prone to violent outbursts. His daughter-in-law had reportedly confided in friends about her fear of living in the same household, but felt trapped by societal expectations and familial duty. What was perhaps most alarming was the number of warning signs that had been ignored. Instances of verbal abuse, minor physical altercations, and even veiled threats were dismissed by those around him. To many in the community, Long was simply old-fashioned, adhering to a strict code of discipline. One investigator summed it up poignantly. This tragedy wasn't just the result of one man's actions. It was the product of a collective silence, a silence that allowed abuse to fester until it culminated in the unimaginable. In the small, stark interrogation room of the Kaijiang District police station, Mouliang sat across from the lead investigator. The dim light above cast sharp shadows across his weathered face. He looked neither distraught nor regretful. His gaze was steady, his posture rigid. When asked why he committed such a heinous act, Long's response was chilling in its simplicity. She deserved to die. The lead investigator pressed further, presenting photos of the crime scene and detailing the extent of the victim's injuries. Long's expression remained unchanging, his tone detached. She defied me, he explained, as if that alone was justification. To him, her resistance wasn't just an insult, it was a threat to the fragile authority he believed he had to maintain within the household. The officers probing the case were unsettled not just by Long's actions, but by his lack of remorse. He showed no signs of guilt, no hesitation in recounting the events. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer. He was enforcing order, correcting what he perceived as a B. As the interrogation unfolded, a team of psychologists worked behind the scenes to construct a profile of Long Mouliang. Their findings were as disturbing as the crime itself. Experts described Long as a man consumed by paranoia and delusional thinking. He had developed an obsessive need to control those around him, particularly his daughter-in-law, whom he viewed as a disruptive force in his household. For years, this need for control had festered, fueled by cultural and societal norms that often placed elder family members above reproach. In Long's world, one psychologist explained, he wasn't just a father-in-law, he was the ultimate authority. Her defiance was not just a challenge, it was an existential threat to his identity. Long's delusions were further exacerbated by his isolation and the lack of external intervention. Those around him dismissed his behavior as eccentric or old-fashioned, enabling a toxic environment where his anger and paranoia went unchecked. This societal indifference, combined with Long's own mental instability, created the perfect storm for the tragedy that unfolded. Long Mouliang's mindset was not formed in a vacuum. It was shaped by cultural and societal factors that had persisted for generations. In the rural community of Kaijiang District, traditional hierarchies often placed the family patriarch in an unassailable position. Respect for elders was deeply ingrained, to the point where questioning or confronting their behavior was seen as taboo. This cultural backdrop allowed Long's behavior to escalate unchecked. Family members turned a blind eye to his controlling tendencies, and neighbors dismissed his outbursts as mere quirks of an aging man. When warning signs began to emerge, threats, verbal abuse, and minor acts of aggression, they were ignored or rationalized. It's a tragic irony, noted one sociologist. The very values meant to uphold family harmony became the chains that trapped the victim and silenced those who might have helped her. This silence wasn't just a failure of individuals, it was a societal failure, one that allowed an environment of fear and control to grow unchecked until it reached its devastating conclusion. The revelation of Long Mouliang's crime sent shockwaves across Kaijiang District and beyond. In a nation grappling with its own evolving perceptions of justice, family, and mental health, the brutality of the case was impossible to ignore. The public response was a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Social media platforms erupted with discussions, hashtags, and debates. Posts expressing sympathy for the victim contrasted sharply with comments blaming her for failing to respect the family hierarchy. This divisive discourse laid bare the cultural tensions simmering beneath the surface of rural and urban China. Protests were organized in several cities, with activists demanding stricter enforcement of domestic abuse laws and better mental health resources for rural communities. In Kaijiang District itself, however, the reaction was quieter. Fear lingered among neighbors who had been complicit in their silence, and family members avoided public appearances, unwilling to confront their role in the tragedy. The media's involvement was inevitable, and for weeks headlines across China were dominated by the details of the crime. Newspapers carried stark images of the crime scene juxtaposed with serene photos of Kaijiang's countryside, creating a haunting contrast. Television anchors described the case in somber tones, focusing on the unimaginable suffering of the victim and the psychological unraveling of her killer. As the media spotlight intensified, conversations about domestic abuse and mental health began to take root in public discourse. Activists used the case as a rallying point to demand legislative reforms, including harsher penalties for abusers and more accessible mental health services in rural areas. For the victim's family, the attention brought both solace and scrutiny. While some members were seen as enablers of Long's behavior, others emerged as advocates for change, publicly acknowledging the failures that led to the crime. Their courage in facing public condemnation inspired others to speak out about similar experiences, breaking the cycle of silence. Though the public outcry could not undo the horror of what had occurred, it sparked a wave of awareness that resonated across the nation. For many, this was no longer just a story about a single crime, it was a call to action. As the investigation drew to a close, the wheels of justice turned swiftly. Mouliang faced a litany of charges, including murder, dismemberment, and abuse of power within the family. The case garnered such widespread attention that it was expedited through the courts, with prosecutors pushing for the harshest penalties allowed under Chinese law. In the courtroom, the gruesome details of the crime were laid bare once more. Photographs of the victim's disfigured body, forensic analysis, and expert testimonies painted a chilling picture of a man consumed by his own delusions. Mouliang's defense, however, was unsettling. He claimed he never intended to kill his daughter-in-law, only to discipline her for what he perceived as disrespect. The court was unconvinced. After weeks of hearings, Long was convicted of premeditated murder and aggravated assault. The presiding judge delivered a scathing condemnation of Long's actions, stating, "This crime is not just an affront to the law, but to the very fabric of human decency." Long was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a punishment that some argued was too lenient given the horrific nature of his actions. For many, the sentence was a bittersweet victory. While justice had been served, no punishment could undo the suffering endured by the victim or erase the trauma left in its wake. For the victim's family, the trial marked the beginning of a long and painful journey toward healing. Her parents, who had been inconsolable in the aftermath of the crime, became outspoken advocates for victims' rights. They worked closely with local organizations to raise awareness about domestic violence and the dangers of unchecked family hierarchies. But the community of Kaijiang District faced its own reckoning. Neighbors who had ignored the warning signs now grappled with guilt and regret. Some took steps to break the culture of silence that had allowed such a tragedy to occur, speaking openly about their own experiences with abuse. Schools and local organizations began hosting workshops on mental health and family dynamics, aiming to prevent future tragedies. Beyond Kaijiang, the case became a lightning rod for national reform. Legislators introduced new policies aimed at protecting victims of domestic abuse, including stricter enforcement of existing laws and the establishment of anonymous hotlines for at-risk individuals. Mental health services in rural areas, long neglected, began receiving increased funding, and public awareness campaigns emphasized the importance of intervention and speaking out. For activists and advocates, the case was both a tragedy and a turning point. It highlighted the pervasive nature of abuse and the societal complicity that often enables it. While Mouliang's actions could never be undone, the awareness sparked by his crime became a beacon of hope for others who had suffered in silence. The story of Mouliang and his daughter-in-law is one that will linger in the minds of many, not just for its brutality, but for the deeper questions it forces us to confront. Could this tragedy have been prevented? The warning signs were there: the controlling behavior, the verbal abuse, the isolation of the victim. Yet in a society where family dynamics are often considered private matters, the cries for help were drowned out by silence. It's easy to condemn Mouliang for his heinous actions, but this case is not just about one man's monstrous behavior. It's about the collective failure of those who stood by and said nothing. It's a reminder that silence can be as deadly as the act itself. Societal norms often bind us to dangerous traditions that dictate we shouldn't interfere in family matters, that mental health is a luxury, that respect for elders supersedes all else. But at what cost? This case underscores the importance of vigilance, of speaking up when something doesn't feel right. The victim's life might have been saved if someone had challenged the status quo, if someone had stepped forward and said, "Enough." Change begins with awareness, and awareness begins with us. Whether it's recognizing the signs of abuse, offering help to a neighbor in distress, or demanding better resources for mental health, each of us has a role to play in preventing tragedies like this. Now we turn to you. Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had intervened earlier? What would you have done if you had seen the warning signs? These are not hypothetical questions. They're questions that we must all confront in our own lives and communities. As you leave this story behind, take a moment to reflect on the ways you can make a difference, because silence is not just complicity, it's permission. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, question, or even ache for justice, then don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue shedding light on stories like this. By sharing this video, you're not just spreading awareness. You're helping to create a world where speaking up can save lives. Do you have thoughts on this case? Maybe you've heard of similar stories or know someone who's experienced something like this. Share your insights in the comments below. Conversations like these are where change begins. And don't forget, this isn't the end. Join us in our next episode where we delve into another gripping case with twists you won't see coming. Thank you for watching and for being part of this journey. Together, we can turn stories of tragedy into calls for justice. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the most important thing you can do is to speak up.